Welcome back to the Popperian Podcast, the podcast where we look into the life and the work of the philosopher Karl Popper. And on today's show, we have Jonathan Rauch. Now, Jonathan is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, an award-winning journalist, the author of numerous books. And the two that we're going to speak about today are Kindly Inquisitors, The New Attacks on Free Thought, and The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth. Two books written almost 30 years apart. And the strain of Popper that runs through them, I was surprised as I sat down and read them both. There was a really strong strain of Popper there. So I might start with a very Popperian question, actually, which is the problem. So knowledge starts with a problem for Popper. What was the problem? What were you writing the first book about? Because as the subtitle seems to indicate there's a new attack on freedom of thought. And let's take us there to that moment. And why it is so prescient, because it feels like a lot of those new attacks perhaps are the same kind of new attacks we're feeling today.
Yeah, I hear that all the time, that a book I wrote almost 30 years ago is more relevant than ever. And I suppose, unfortunately, that it is. When I set out to write Kindly Inquisitors as a much younger man, I was 29, actually, when I quit my job to start working on it. It was in the context of two things that were going on. One was the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, which was really, it turned out, we didn't know it at the time, or at least we didn't have the language for it, but it was the first international cancel campaign done without social media, but very, very effectively nonetheless. And that was terrifying as I saw the power of that. People were killed around the world. Publishers were intimidated. Politicians responded weakly. The second thing going on was the birth of the original so-called political correctness movement on campus, the hatching of speech codes, the persecution and punishment of students who were seen to be deviant. And both of those things struck me as serious threats to the intellectual culture at the time, and also improperly appreciated threats. They were treated simply as attacks on free speech per se. And it seemed to me at the time that, in fact, they went deeper, that they were challenges to the system that we rely on to make knowledge and discover truth. And that's what led me toward Kindly Inquisitors. I talk about it for shorthand as a free speech book, but it's really not. It's really about what is science? Why is it very broad and very important? Where does knowledge come from in a free society? And how do we protect knowledge in a free society?
There is a quote about halfway through that book, and it says, if you want to clear a room at a cocktail party, say epistemology. And we're going to say epistemology a lot here, so I hope we don't clear any rooms. But as you said there, if it's freedom of speech is not this emotional thing where we just have this nice impulse, I want to say what I want to say because I want to say it. If it's more than that, if it is epistemology, why is it epistemology? Why is freedom of thought so closely tied up with knowledge?
Well, freedom of thought is just the input. It's all of the stuff that people say and think. Popper refers to them, if they're testable at least, as hypotheses. And most of them are wrong. The trick for any society is to figure out which of these many, many propositions and hypotheses are closest to the truth, and then achieve their social adoption. Which means, of course, individuals can believe anything they want. They can, believe that the angel Moroni delivered 2 golden tablets to Joseph Smith. They can believe that Elvis is still alive. That's all fine. But in order to say something is knowledge and treat it as knowledge, we have to put all of this free speech, all of these hypotheses through a very elaborate process, which Popper calls science. I call it liberal science because I believe that Popper's notions were far more applicable than I think possibly he did. So I coined this term liberal science to mean the whole knowledge-making system of a free and open society. And it includes not just the hard sciences, but the soft sciences and literary criticism, and also, for that matter, journalism, and everything else that's in the professional knowledge-seeking industry. And I argued it runs on falsifiability and public criticism, a very Popperian view, and that these new attacks that we were seeing were basically attacking it at its weakest point, which is that criticism can be offensive. It can seem wrongheaded. It can seem emotionally hurtful. And in fact, it very often does. And so a lot of people were trying to turn criticism into a human rights offense. And that, it seemed to me, cut to the very heart of liberal science.
Now, for many people, they may think that may be true, but it's still shockingly unpleasant. There is a wonderful quote here of yours. I'm going to quote you here. To advance knowledge, we must suffer. We must all sometimes suffer. Worse than that, we must inflict suffering upon others. Now, that for some people may sound like, even if this does achieve knowledge, perhaps there's a nicer way to go about it.
One of the things that liberal science, this is, again, the term I used in Kindly Inquisitors for the whole knowledge-making system, not just the hard sciences. It succeeded in my new book by the Constitution of Knowledge and the reality-based community. But one of the things that liberal science works very hard to do is manage conflict in a way that minimizes, without attempting to eliminate, hurt and offensiveness and so forth. And so that's why a professor, for example, who writes a paper who says that, when Lea-Henry writes that Rauch has got it completely wrong, he doesn't begin his paper saying, "Jonathan Rauch, you ignorant slut." That's a reference to a famous Saturday Night Live skit, in case anyone is shocked. He begins it with a review of the literature and some very detailed characterizations. And then he puts forth his hypothesis, and then he criticizes mine, and he tries to keep it as impersonal as he can. We go to great lengths to depersonalize this process so that offense for the sake of offense is minimized, and so that the personal injury the criticism does is minimized. And even more important, another, I think, of Popper's greatest insights, and underappreciated because its social implications are so vast, is, to paraphrase him, we kill our hypotheses instead of each other. What we should see ourselves as doing in this process of criticism is attacking the hypothesis and not the person. And that's very important, because I can criticize you, but unless you've done something really terrible, like, plagiarized or made stuff up, your reputation will be intact. You'll simply lose the argument. We'll both go on to the next argument. So that I argue this system, although, yes, of course, it can be emotionally painful, criticism almost always is. It's far less painful and far more productive as a way to manage conflict and find knowledge than any other system. And that the ones who set out on the principle of reducing offense, reducing blasphemy, reducing wrongheadedness, stamping out prejudice, these in fact become very authoritarian and crushingly oppressive very quickly.
Now, that you touched on it there. That is a really central part of this, of Popper and yourself. So the idea is that we let our hypotheses die in the place of ourselves here. So this is a peace-inducing mechanism. This is more than just a knowledge-creating mechanism. Of course, this is going to run into what a large part of your second book is about, which we will get to. But a central part of this is the process produces peace, because if, in fact, we don't get to a place where we are letting our hypotheses die in our place, then we are dying, we are fighting, and we're back to a Hobbesian war, which you quote quite heavily in your second book.
Yes, and of course, that's how we did it for many centuries. I'd be interested in your view, Jed, but that it always seemed to me that in some sense, the political and social aspect of Popper's philosophy of science was kind of underdeveloped, at least by him. But it's also interesting that he also writes The Open Society and His Enemies. When I set out on the path of writing this book, I think I started with The Open Society and Its Enemies before reaching the logic of scientific discovery and then objective knowledge in some of his other works. And Popper, interestingly, for a philosopher of science, is deeply engaged with the question of how you run a society and the differences between liberal societies and absolutism. And it always struck me as that this aspect, that social peace is, I think, the most important single product of the logic of scientific discovery, that he never quite fully teased this out. He was pretty content to leave it in the realm of knowledge and understanding the limits and powers of science. But it always seemed to me that his most well, maybe the most important contribution of his philosophy is helping us understand how to avoid bloodshed in controversies about truth.
I think you're absolutely right about that. What I like about that is it flows on directly from the epistemology. If the epistemology is true, then the political system and the social system, it should also be true. If you apply critical rationalism, Popper's theory, to, as you do in your second book, journalism, then you should get, if the epistemology is true, a better journalism, a better form, a better outcome at the end of this. And if it fails to achieve a better outcome than a more authoritarian one, then Popper has a problem. It runs all the way back to the epistemology. And I think you agree that it often doesn't. It does produce better outcomes, though with a little caveat about institutions, which we will get to in the second one there. But there is a fairly large expanded body of not just the immediate disciples of Popper, but people since Popper who have spent a lot of time writing the critical rationalism of art, the critical rationalism of religion, and doing that expanding work for Popper. And we should include yourself in that as well.
Yeah, I don't actually know those names, and I'd like to know more of them. But it struck me pretty quickly in my early 30s when I was embarking on this work that Popper's very interested in the hard sciences, and he seems to have in mind what almost everyone at that stage, and maybe even today, have in mind when they write about philosophy of science, which is physics. There's kind of almost this physics obsession, which is how do we develop theories of reality and what's the metaphysics behind that, and how do we find errors, and is it paradigm shifts or is it gradual science and all of that. But it struck me that Popper's method of social organization, that is conjectures and refutations on a society-wide scale with essentially interchangeable persons, this is applicable to really any kind of dispute about knowledge or truth, right through journalism, through ethics, for example. Now, it may not be able to resolve these controversies as cleanly as you can resolve at least some questions in the hard sciences. You can't do an experiment really to discover if abortion is the killing of a human being. But Popper's method can organize really almost any kind of social debate in terms of the things it requires people to do and the way they conduct themselves when they do it. And that's the sense in which it seems to me that Popper was kind of underappreciated in his time, as he thought he was, but in some sense even underappreciated by himself, that his method was very widely applicable and could be constructive in any sphere, even if not in producing crisp knowledge, objective knowledge, in creating a socially peaceful and productive way to conduct all of these very difficult conversations.
Let's get into those conversations. Actually, before we do, I might start with something else here. And I think this is interesting. This is fascinating. So I think a lot of people, I might start with a section from your book. You mentioned Elvis before, and you talked about a lot of people still think Elvis is alive. And you wrote at one point in humor in your book, we don't send social security checks. We don't send the IRS around there looking for Elvis and his income. And you have there was a moment that you spoke about here. You said on December 4th, 1984, a young girl named Natalie died of a very painful infection. The cause was a common bacteria, and it would have been cured by antibiotics. The parents, however, did not use the antibiotics. They used prayer. And you'd go on to say, of course, that sounds preposterous to many of us. And I think this is just correct me if I'm wrong, this seems to be a central problem here, a central theme, and the problem where all this starts. Because if you ask people why the parents were wrong, they often have very bad ideas. They often can't say why the parents were wrong, or their ideas sound painfully authoritarian sometimes.
Yeah, they're wrong. That's that. I opened Kindly Inquisitors with an episode that's kind of funny, but epistemologically, I think really quite challenging, which is some person that I think it's like a county commissioners meeting, I forget, in the United States, but some local legislative body, or I guess city council, says he's hearing from constituents that they're seeing flying saucers, UFOs. And he says, well, let's build a landing pad for them so we can find out, give them a place to land. So if they're there, they can come down and say hello. And of course, this was treated as laughable. And in some sense, it is, quite funny. But there is an epistemological problem here that's hinted at that's very fundamental and very difficult, which is for social purposes, for public purposes. How do we decide what's actually true enough to act upon? In other words, what do we regard as objective knowledge in Popper's terminology? And, we can just say, well, the guy's a nut, it can't possibly happen. But how do we know that? And if, say, a majority of people in that particular town think that UFOs are running around and needing a place to land, on what basis do we say they shouldn't? And this is where free speech ideology lets us down, because it just says, well, let us, 1,000 flowers bloom and somehow the marketplace of ideas will sort it all out. And this, to some extent, I guess it's toward the second book, but to some extent, it's where Popper lets us down a bit, because he assumes that there's a process of social criticism which will do the job of weeding it all out. But of course, in everyday life, in everyday politics, we can't always count on that to act quickly enough, for example, or to come out reliably with the right answer. And then how do we impose that answer? On what grounds do we do that? So that's a very deep question. And it sends us into a different realm, which is the realm of politics and knowledge. And that's what Kindly Inquisitors and the Constitution of Knowledge both try to grapple with. What's the social system we use for deciding these conflicts? And what's it grounded in? And how do we legitimize it as compared to all the other systems people might use, oracles, or just claiming revelation, the way the Taliban do it, or whatever.
So why don't we get truth from a marketplace of ideas? Jumping ahead a little bit, we will come back. Why don't we? It seems a lot of people would agree that you get the best outcomes from perhaps an economic system by having an economic bit of competition. You get the best sporting players from having them compete as thoroughly as possible, and etc. Why isn't it true that people, if you have a marketplace of intellectual ideas, that the best will rise to the top? Because it seems, and this is where I think you do clash with Popper most significantly, is that that he does have this idea that through constant criticism, the best ideas will rise eventually to the top, and we'll be left with a whole range of error-corrected wrong ideas which we've discarded, and the few remain in, which of course we don't accept as truth, but are there. And why does this not happen in a marketplace of knowledge?
Well, this, pardon me, this branches us off into the journey from Kindly Inquisitors, the book I wrote 28 years ago, to the book that I just published a couple of months ago. So maybe should we embark on that journey then?
Yeah, let's make that jump.
What you're inviting us to do.
Yes, I think we can come back to Kindly Inquisitors in a little bit. Yeah, let's make that jump forward.
Popper is, I came to think, over a period of many years, I went off and did other things. I was a big activist and proponent of same-sex marriage for many years. That was my big investment. But in the last 4 or 5 years, especially with the rise of Donald Trump, I concluded that we were seeing a whole additional wave of attacks on liberal science, as I called it. I came to call it the Constitution of Knowledge for reasons we'll discuss. And that this wave too was perhaps even more powerful than the first. It was coming from both the left and the right. It was being answered inadequately. And I saw that the different versions of the marketplace of ideas metaphor, or the notion of a kind of marketplace of criticism, was necessary but insufficient. And in fact, it was insufficient in ways that had left us, liberals, people like me, in places like America right now, without answers to hard questions like, well, these new attacks were exploiting freedom of speech. They weren't trying to crack down on it. This is like Russian-style disinformation, first as practiced by the Russians, and then as practiced by Donald Trump and the Republican Party. And this is, instead of censorship, you flood the zone with shit, as Stephen Bannon, a Trump advisor, put it. You just put out so many lies and half-truths, exaggerations, conspiracy theories. people can't possibly keep up. They become cynical about the system. The media can't fact check it all. You're chasing it all the time. And every time you knock down one, 10 more replace it. This is a very powerful and tested information warfare strategy. And saying, well, free speech doesn't help you because it's exploiting free speech. And Popper doesn't really help you with that. He's assuming, it turns out, a great deal of implicit structure in the critical conversation. And it seemed to me that was the piece that was missing. That Popper surprisingly didn't really seem to have a lot of interest in what is the particular kind of structure that a society needs in order to do this criticism in the right way so that it's constructive. And in fact, the statement I just made is a bit unfair to Popper because no one else seemed to have shown much interest in that either. They just kind of assumed you'd have free speech and that would create a marketplace of ideas, and out of that, truth would arise. Well, there are problems with that. The biggest problem is that it turns out that humans are very badly wired to discover abstract knowledge. We're pretty good about, is that a tiger in the bush or just a breeze? Or where is the neighboring tribe camped? We're really quite bad at what is causing our children to die, or why are the crops failing? We go for something like, it must be that witch. Did you see how she looked at me? Go kill witches. Or you're praying to the wrong God. No, I'm not. Well, let's go to war. So we kill each other. That's mostly how we did it. We're full of psychological bugs and biases that make us very influenced by the people around us. We believe what enhances our status, not necessarily what's true. We seek ideas and even perceptions unconsciously that confirm our biases. So refuting conjectures is, if they're our own conjectures, is virtually impossible. So we're just riddled with these cognitive distortions and biases. And if you just let people kind of have at it in an unstructured environment, you get, guess what? Twitter. You get social media. You get people just pursuing their own biases, talking to their own tribe, denouncing the other tribe, flaming each other. You get chaos. Well, it seemed to me that the question then is, what is the structure? What are the settings, the details, the norms, the institutions that turn this kind of random chaos, this cacophony of people behaving badly, into a structured conversation in which hypotheses are presented in a certain way and falsified in a certain other way? And people are taught how to do this, and there are regulations to make sure that it happens, and incentives so that people do it productively instead of destructively. And that's what brought me to the second book. The big missing piece, I thought, of the puzzle was the constitution of knowledge. These are the social settings, the institutions and norms that structure the conversation that Popper is talking about. I like to think, I'm sure this is vanity talking, Jed, but I like to think if Popper were around today, he would be at least as interested in this question as I am. And he too would be probably much better and more powerfully elucidating the structures and rules for the information system that's required to create his system of conjectures and refutations.
Well, I agree with the first part, and I disagree with the second part. I said to you just when we started this, I've read a lot of books about Popper, and he is a very clear writer. And we're going to get to some of your the ways in which you term his phrases and tweak them slightly. But I don't think I've read a clearer interpretation of Popper, and a clear interpretation for the importantly for people on the street who may not be engaged in philosophy. I think Popper could learn a few lessons in clarity from you actually on this, and I think he would be engaged. But I might start with a question there, and I wonder, as a Popperian yourself, or someone who at least follows Popper in a significant number of ways, when you made this turn from the first book to the second, where you think there's a problem here with institutions, that criticism and error correction is not enough, does it make you slightly nervous? Because I know you do cover your bases in your book, but as soon as you were speaking there, it makes me slightly nervous, because if you need more than just criticism, if you need more than just testable ideas, and this kind of very minimal structure of criticism and conjectures, and then more criticisms, it does conjure an image in the mind where you are limiting certain possibilities of future knowledge. It limits pluralism. It limits possibility. It says knowledge has to be created in this way, in this manner, and you have further narrowed it down from Popper's very minimal idea.
It may. Excuse me. I don't know that it limits knowledge, but it constrains our pathways toward knowledge. That is true. It says at any given moment that we have a heavy tail, a heavy legacy of propositions, hypotheses that have been elaborately vetted, withstood many types of criticism, but all of them within sort of the broad scientific tradition. A criticism of the theory of evolution is not allowed to be, well, God told me it's wrong. And I suppose some people would say that limits our knowledge. So yeah, it certainly puts constraints on the output of the system at any given time. It creates a kind of library and archive of objective knowledge, which has stood up for a long time and which you basically have to learn and master, and at least initially in your career accept, or at least understand before you criticize it. So yeah, it limits your options if that's what you're worried about. That's a feature and not a bug. This is why I think in order to solve this problem of understanding the settings, the social settings that get you toward a society that's peaceful and knowledgeable, you need to reach over sideways out of epistemology. You need to reach over to James Madison and his constitution, as well as the other constitutions in the world, the British Constitution, which is unwritten, like the Constitution of Knowledge. You have to reach over sideways, and you have to understand that constraining choices is exactly what they were up to. They were constraining choices, and at the same time, they were compelling social negotiation. So you can't make a law by just announcing that you have a good idea and it's now the law. You're going to have to go to Congress, and you're going to have to do a lot of stuff, and then it's going to have to stand up in court, and checks and balances and many rules and institutions. And of course that constrains us. And you're also going to have to rely on professionals to do this work. The politics in America is largely a professional activity, and liberal science is also almost, not entirely, but almost exclusively a professional activity. And these are features. They're not bugs. They help us function peacefully. They get us to peaceful outcomes. But no, they are not anarchic.
You said something there, which a lot of Popperians, the alarm bells would be going off again, is when you started talking about Madisonian epistemology, which is a very core part of the constitution of knowledge here. And you said the word negotiation. And a couple of other times in the book, you've used the word consensus. And for Popperians, this is almost a blasphemous word for many of them, because they think, why would you want to negotiate on knowledge? Why would you want to have a consensus about knowledge? And I know you cover your bases in your book, but I might get you to do it again here. So, for example, if Lea-Henry and Rauch are disagreeing about a particular aspect of biology, and we each have our theories and we each write our papers, we're not asked to come into the room and negotiate and form a consensus and find a third theory which shares half of yours and half of mine. We fight it out. And so that's, for many Popperians, is a red flag in some way. So let's take us to those words, consensus, negotiation, and what you mean by them.
Yeah, we should go there, because this is an area where I part ways with Popper, and I'm much closer to the other great patron saint of both of these books, and that's the American epistemologist Charles Sanders Peirce, who is an extraordinary figure in so many ways. Popper's system, at least as I understand it, relies heavily on individuals talking in some sense to other individuals, and it relies heavily on falsification as what it is that they're doing. Now, you'll stop me at any given time, because I'm sure I'm oversimplifying. Popper was no dummy. He understood science better than I do. But it seemed to me that is a system which is too thin to take into account what most of science is doing on any given day. Science, I don't mean just the hard sciences. I mean what I do. I'm trained as a journalist, and I now work at Brookings and do a lot of work on public policy. And on any given day, what's happening is less to do with I'm criticizing individual X or Y. Here's why they're wrong. It's more to do with me trying to persuade the world that I'm right. It's less about falsification than about validation or justification or whatever you want to call it. And that's, in fact, most of what scientists do, advocate theories. Of course, they criticize others as well, but falsification is far from what they do. What they're really trying to do is persuade others in the system that they're right. And they'll adduce all kinds of evidence to do that, but they'll also go to aesthetics. For example, you talked about this very interestingly on one of your shows. They'll say this is a simpler theory. It's a more elegant theory. It does more work. They will avert to morals in many fields. They'll say, well, that can't possibly be right because it would result in the death or injury of millions. They do all of these things, and one has to account for all of this richness in order to understand what's going on in liberal science. In that sense, I was influenced by Feyerabend. I'm not sure I pronounced his name correctly, but I thought when I read him that he was basically right. It's not just any one thing that science is doing, and you wouldn't want it to be doing any one thing. Nor is it primarily individual to individual. It's all mediated through, for example, journals and conferences and other kinds of presentations. In journalism, it's newsrooms. In law, it's courts. In government, it's administrative procedures and bureaucracies. It's the institutions that are doing a lot of the work of sifting and comparing and forcing people selecting ideas and then pushing them out to others for examination, organizing peer review, and so on. And it seemed to me that this process is closer to the US constitutional process of a kind of ordered system of social negotiation, not individual negotiation necessarily, but social negotiation, in which lots of individuals are forced to work through a lot of channels and institutions involving checks and balances and distributed power and authority and a lot of mores and rules about how to behave. And it's forcing them through these systems that produces a larger social negotiation. That's ultimately mediated through compromise in the world of politics, and I think through persuasion in what I call the reality-based community. That's the community of people who follow the constitution of knowledge. Ultimately, what they're engaged in is a big social negotiation, which people are trying to persuade each other. And in the end of the day, it's those who follow the rules properly and manage to persuade the most followers who are creating knowledge. And the great advantage of this system is that it's so decentralized and so depersonalized, it's impossible for any one faction to take over. It's much easier. It's much more approachable. People are much more interchangeable in terms of how they relate to it. And you get knowledge out of it because you can organize so many minds so quickly to tackle a problem and figure it out as they try to persuade each other. That's what put the COVID shot in my arm with really incredible speed. And you also get peace out of it because the only way to make knowledge is to persuade. You can't coerce. I can't just say, well, Jed, you might be right, but since you're wrong, I'm going to kill you or ostracize you. Ultimately, I may not be able to persuade you. It's not a one-on-one negotiation, but I will try to persuade a large body of people that I'm right. And hopefully, eventually, maybe you'll come around.
Do you, are you personally not frustrated by institutions? So I assume a lot of people listen, and Popperians or not, may think about institutions, and perhaps we should clarify what an institution is as well. And they have these images of institutions, and they're incredibly frustrating things, drenched with bureaucracies. And often you look at American politics, for example, or any politics, but let's talk about America now. And because it does have this wonderful constitution that guarantees freedom of speech, and as strongly as I can imagine any other country in the world. But when it comes to the politics, when people get elected and they have policies and they can never enact the policies because they don't control, because they don't have the power over enough chambers of Congress and Senate and then the executive body, and then there's a whole range of laws that get in their way. People often look at this and are incredibly frustrated, and they think institutions, rather than producing knowledge, slow down the growth of knowledge, slow down progress.
Historically, it's the development of the institutions which made the development of modern science and all its offshoots, what I call liberal science, possible. My background, perhaps I should have said this initially, but my undergraduate training in college was in history of science. And something I was astonished to discover when I did a thesis on the birth of modern geology around the turn of the 19th century was that the critical factor was the establishment of institutions that changed what had been an unstructured and really very savage controversy that was leading nowhere except to great anger and social unrest. It created a society that structured the inquiry and sort of sent proto-geologists out into the world hunting for fossils, compiling them, creating archives, beginning to exchange papers in a structured way. With a heavy emphasis on empiricism, but it was the institution that made that possible, and that the development of science, right back to the founding of the Royal Society, which was chaired by Isaac Newton, the key development was the organization of places like, the American Chemical Association, the American Economics Association, and the geophysical societies, and then the creation of the universities, which are critical infrastructural nodes in terms of the institutions. They organize so much of the research. And then the creation of the journals, which starts really happening as recently as only about 100 years ago. We take it for granted. So it's the creation of these institutional hubs that makes it possible to go from a bunch of atomistic individuals simply arguing with each other and, in a kind of Hobbesian world to an organized world where ideas are being treated systematically, where people are being trained in scientific and discursive procedures, where these are being passed down to subsequent generations, where prizes are being given for good work, which incentivizes good behavior, which are making decisions about professional credentials and ethics. All of that work is institutional. So I think you can't really understand what's going on inside the world of conjectures and refutations if you leave out the institutions. And that's my complaint, not only with Popper, but with virtually everyone, because liberals have such an individualistic view of the world. We just leave all of that out. That said, sure, institutions frustrating, absolutely. Do they make and sometimes perpetuate mistakes? Of course they do. Can they become dysfunctional? Well, look at the US Congress right now. Actually, it did a pretty good job with coronavirus relief. But in many other ways, it's dysfunctional. But that means our assignment isn't to grouse about institutions and wish we didn't have them. It's to try to understand why they're dysfunctional. And in the case of modern America, who's attacking them, and how to respond to that, how to strengthen them and repair them, and how to put their enemies on the back foot. And that's the work that my book, The Constitution of Knowledge, tries to do. Get people to see these institutions that are creating knowledge, the norms they rely on, the rules, understand those rules, and defend those rules.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far, and I apologize for this brief interruption, but I will take this moment to briefly send out a plug for the podcast itself. The Popperian Podcast is something that I've been planning for quite a while, and it's something that I want to keep running month to month. But to do so, it's going to need your help. If you're willing or able or interested, please go to the links below the podcast and support us however you can. It will be your help as listeners that keeps the podcast going and keeps the content coming out. And I thank you in advance. And with that said, we will now return to the second half of the interview. Thanks for listening. You mentioned Charles Peirce before, and you call him in your book the greatest American philosopher you probably never heard of. And he does play a central role in this, and he comes up with network epistemology. Now, you've touched on it a fair bit, but he's got this wonderful quote, and I might get you to explain it a little bit more here. It says, individualism and falsity are one and the same. So what does he mean by that?
This is, well, I should say a bit for listeners perhaps who don't know about Peirce. Would it be all right just to give a moment of a biography?
Yes, please.
Peirce was thrived in the latter half of the 19th century in the United States, and he was a founder of the school of epistemology that became known as pragmatism, though he was so unhappy with the direction that pragmatism subsequently went that he put in a new syllable for his own version called pragmaticism. He was also, I believe, the first person and the most visionary person to develop the idea that knowledge is not and inherently never can be something that individuals create, objective knowledge, I mean, that it's the product of interactions of people who are basically interchangeable. So he says, knowledge is not what I perceive, not what I believe, not what I think is true, nor is it what you believe or think or perceive, nor is it even what we as a tribe, like-minded people, believe and perceive. It's what no particular person believes and perceives. It has to work for anybody who comes along and looks at it regardless of their personal background or tribe or identity. And that once you create a network of people who are checking each other, examining each other's ideas according to impersonal rules under which it's any reasonable person must be satisfied, not just me and not just you, then you created the basis for an expanding network of people developing and checking hypotheses. And it's the outcome of that system and nothing else that is our knowledge. Now, this is 100 years ahead of its time. He doesn't have the term for it, but he's invented network epistemology. I think he's ahead of Popper and really, again, everyone else in his understanding that knowledge is a product of a social system and a particular type of social system. I think Popper, for example, as well as the positivists and many others are more individualistic and atomized in their view of where knowledge comes from. They're more interested in what are the habits of a good scientist. They'll tell you a good scientist has to be non-dogmatic. Well, we know many scientists are very dogmatic, and that's a good engine of science. We want them to be fierce, defending their points of view. Peirce has no problem with that. He says, sure, we want people to be open to falsification, but even if they're not, as long as the system is open to falsification, that'll be all right, or persuasion. Peirce is the guy who says, if there's something that only I perceive or believe, it's indistinguishable literally from a hallucination. Knowledge for him comes from this network. Well, it's 100 years before people are ready to understand that. Peirce in his own time desperately, he's actually pretty indigent. He's trying for most of his life to get a professorship at Johns Hopkins or Harvard or anywhere. And the great philosopher and psychologist William James is working very hard on his behalf, but he can never even get a professional post. He leaves behind now 8 volumes of collected works. It takes decades to appreciate him. Now I think he's kind of partially appreciated. His genius, though, is still not recognized enough. But this is, I think, if anyone is ahead of Popper in my ranking, it would have to be Peirce, because he understands so much of what you need to understand right now to see what's gone wrong in, for example, the United States in social media, which is a network, an epistemic network, but run on very bad social principles instead of good social principles.
So why is it that people don't speak to each other in this marketplace of ideas? Your background is in journalism. You're a journalist and an author, of course. So why is it that people do not speak to each other? I guess my question is something like this. A lot of people, and myself, I'm slightly inclined to this idea. People complain that we're in this unique age where fake news is abundant and people are not listening to each other. They're stuck in their ways and they're heavy with bias. And the instinct in me, and I think other people, is it's always been this way. It's always been something like this. It's always been problematic. It's always been a challenge. And yet we've somehow made it through. So is there something different about the modern moment?
No, not really. Not in the sense that it's reinventing all the fundamentals. You're right. We've been here before. And when you say somehow we made it through, the point of my book, The Constitution of Knowledge, is what's the somehow? What is it that a society needs to get right if it wants to convert information, which is free and very, very plentiful, into knowledge, into facts, which are extremely scarce and very precious? You've got to get a lot of things right. So what are those things you have to get right? So yeah, we've been here before. When you have just unstructured social conversation about important issues, people basically go to war in a Hobbesian way, and they form up into tribes and then sects, and then they fight each other or just divide, and it all gets very ugly very quickly. We saw that in American journalism in the 19th century. American journalism was a cesspool of fake news and extreme partisanship. In those days, H.L. Mencken, the greatest American journalist of his time, writes about how, as a young reporter, he and the other Baltimore reporters would just, every day, they'd get together over drinks and they'd coordinate and make stuff up and put it all in the paper. And they thought this was hilarious, but it was so much easier than actually, going out and getting the news. So that became a toxic information environment. People began to realize that it was cycling downward in a bad spiral. How does it get fixed? Well, it's the institutions, stupid. Starting in the late 19th, but really early 20th century, you get the creation of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. And the first thing they do is promulgate some codes for how to do journalism, stuff like run corrections, don't make stuff up. We take this all for granted today, but someone had to come up with it, actually, and then create consequences for not doing it. So they organized newsrooms around these principles. Journalism schools come online in universities in the early 20th century. They begin teaching these processes and rules. They're saying, here's how you check a story. You need multiple sources. Here's how you structure it. Then you get prizes. Pulitzer, ironically named after one of the yellow press barons, but another indication that the industry realized that it had to have structure. And within about 2 generations, you go from the world of William Randolph Hearst, maybe arguably starting an entire war based on fake news, to Edward R. Murrow. And the period in American journalism, probably when it did its best work most consistently. So the question today becomes, so now we've got we're back to another very unstructured environment. Another disruption has broken down the barriers and guardrails and norms that we relied on. So can we structure this thing? Can we turn, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and the rest of them into systems that are organized in ways that are friendly to knowledge and structured constructive social conversation, and not unstructured, destructive social conversation? Facebook is working on doing that. I think their oversight board is very interesting. This is a panel that's going to try to transparently and openly create some rules for what does and doesn't go on Facebook. Now, this is actually very much like what journalists did a century ago. Will it work? I don't know. But it's the type of thing that works. It's the type of thing that turned medicine from a bunch of people selling snake oil in the middle of the 19th century into an organized profession with journals and actual science. It's the kind of thing we've got to try.
Now, you mentioned social media there. And I have to ask, because you do mention this, there's a later point in your second book, which must catch a lot of people's eyes when they go through it, because you pause and you do say, just as you've said there, that the great social media giants, the Facebooks, the YouTubes, and Googles of this world and Instagrams, they are doing a decent, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but a good or a decent job of producing institutions that produce knowledge, of cleaning up the institutions and making sure only knowledge comes out the other end of this epistemological funnel that you called it at one point, which I think was a great piece of terminology. So a lot of people would think the opposite. They seem to be the ire of most people's animosity these days. They're staring down their Facebooks and they're saying, you are responsible for all the problems in the world. You are responsible for Donald Trump's and Russian hacking, et cetera, et cetera. So why do you see this differently? And what is it about those panels? Because a lot of people, as soon as you say we're going to have a panel to decide what is true and what's not, people's hairs go up on their arms and they get combative and say, you're silencing me or telling me what is true and what is not?
Well, of course, the whole point of the Constitution of Knowledge is to create some actually really quite rigorous channels and norms that you need to go through in order to claim knowledge. You can say anything you want, but if it's going to go in a textbook, it needs to go through a whole lot of structure. So, of course, people in a free speech culture, a very individualistic culture, there are aspects of that they don't love. On the other hand, it turns out they also don't like being in a toxic information environment where, there's whole networks of disinformation, and they're getting false information about vaccines, and they're being told, vote, don't forget to vote on November 4th, when, of course, election day is November 3rd. So the question is, can you create some guidelines and guardrails that are going to help channel people's impulses and behavior in better directions and create a virtuous spiral? We're in a vicious spiral right now, Jed, and the critics whose case you just made are not wrong. Social media is a big part of the problem. Their business model is deeply flawed. It's to get people's attention, regardless of the truth valence of what's being said. And the way you get people's attention is usually through outrage and falsehood. So they're really stuck in this bind where they're committed from a commercial point of view to a model that's pretty deadly from an epistemic point of view. So I'm not saying they'll solve the problem. What I am saying is they're at least taking it seriously. There's been a sea change in attitudes at places like Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of them. For example, the Christchurch shooting created a come to Jesus moment at YouTube. The thing was streamed live over social media. This is horrific, and they really couldn't do anything about it. So they understand that that's incompatible with a liberal society. So what they're working very hard at is trying to figure out ways to solve the problem. And that is new. Even 5 years ago, the attitude of the big tech companies, the platforms, as people call them, was, it's not our problem. We're just providing the open space for conversation, and people will behave badly. That's their right. I think they now understand that that's an inadequate answer, both as a business model and as a social model. So they're working on it, and I think they're working on it seriously. I don't know that they'll solve it. It's really hard. I will say that in the past, for example, with the invention of the printing press, probably the biggest information disruption ever, maybe bigger than the current one, it was eventually solved. Now, it took a lot of people getting killed over a period of about a century, maybe 150 years to work it out. It did get solved. I hope it doesn't take that long and do that much damage this time. But at least social media is focused on it. Other branches of the reality-based community, and in particular academia, I think are not adequately focused on dealing with these problems, and in some respects are making them worse.
What do you make of the trend of I suppose you call it a trend out there in the world today, that people seem to have this increasing soft spot for authoritarianism? Now, a really important part of your first book, if we bend back to that slightly, was you talk about intellectual authoritarianism, and you go on a wonderful attack on Plato down the same lines as Popper in really fun and interesting ways. And but the attack that you both had, I'll get you to explain that, but it's about appealing to authority for knowledge. And it seemed, I'm not sure how you feel, but there is a sense out there in the world that people just want to be told what is right and what is wrong. How is it that you see it? And do you see people being sucked in by this, or is this something that is not actually happening? What are we missing this?
Is this, you're thinking about stuff like conspiracy theories, or are you thinking about I guess, a yearning for authoritarianism, just for here's the truth, go believe it? Is it that sort of thing you have?
Kind of strongman leaders of the world, someone who'll tell us what is right and we will follow them regardless. It comes in a similar chapter of your book where you talk a lot about skepticism, and people are more than willing to be skeptical of the other side, but they're more than willing to follow their own side down any old rabbit hole that they find here. And it's really that idea that there seems to be a longing in the world for people who are absolutely sure. Of course, I'm thinking Trump a little bit here, but there was something about the complete and utter surety of Trump that seemed to appeal to some people?
So I'd almost flip that on its head. And one of the things I admire about Popper is that this is something I think he understood, as did the founding fathers, that humans are a very tribal species. You know, we basically starve and die if we don't stay in good standing with our tribe. We can't hunt and survive on our own. So we have a deep yearning for tribal solidarity, for anointing a leader. Usually our structures will be quite hierarchical, and some god that we worship will be at the top, but that really means some prince or authority or oracle or politburo. That's kind of what we're wired for. And as Popper, I think, understands, the question isn't why do we submit ourselves to hierarchies and authorities, or why do we have biases and make mistakes? It's why do we ever not submit to hierarchies and authorities? Why do we ever not succumb to biases and mistakes? That's what needs to be explained. And in The Open Society and His Enemies, he's very good about saying that you have to design a system, you have to hope for the best leaders, but you have to plan for the worst, which is exactly the same philosophy that America's founders had when they built the Constitution. Thank goodness they built it as they did, or Donald Trump would have done much more damage, and he did a lot of damage. And the same is true in the realm of epistemology. Why do we actually ever get things right? I mean, how in the world did we organize probably hundreds of thousands of minds in thousands of institutions in the course of only a few weeks to analyze the structure of the coronavirus and then design a vaccine? That's what needs explaining. And the answer is that you've got to have this elaborate system, this constitution of knowledge, in order to make that happen. But it's not self-organizing. That's like, if there's one key insight that I'd like people to leave my book with and leave this conversation with, that our system of making knowledge, of getting things right rather than wrong, of getting beyond our biases and our tribes, it is not self-maintaining. It is not automatic. It needs to be constantly defended, maintained, tweaked, and improved. And it's constantly under attack, and attacked by very sophisticated forces. In the book, I argue that canceling is one form of sophisticated information warfare, and it's working in academia. There are whole fields now in which there are hypotheses, which it's very dangerous even to surface, much less investigate. And another form is the information warfare we're seeing from Trump and QAnon and MAGA, which is to flood the system with conspiracy theories, disinformation, and so on. That's very hard to cope with. That's a very effective means of information warfare. It goes back to the early 20th century. We've got 100 years of experience with it. It's very toxic. We've got to understand this stuff, and we've got to adjust to it.
Why is that, as Steve Bannon's quote, flooding the zone with shit, of just pumping out misinformation as much as possible? Why is it so successful? Because at the very start of this conversation, you spoke about the Rushdie affair, and I told Kemeny try and not just to silence Rushdie, but other people who dare follow in his path. And that was a direct form of silencing. And importantly, in your second book here, you go on to say how, as you've just said there, how shockingly dangerous this is, because it has the same kind of silencing effect. It just does so through much more subtle means.
Well, I fear, Jed, I hope these comments I'm making aren't too long and winding. There's so much to cover. But if it will be okay, I'll do it again. Forgive me, but I'll answer with kind of a big definitional point and then maybe drill down a bit. Mm-hmm. So we have been discussing for most of our conversation the first of several big premises that I want to leave people with in this work. And that's, it's not just the marketplace of ideas, or if you're a Popperian, conjectures and refutations, it's a constitution of knowledge. It's this dense structure that took centuries to refine and develop as social incentives and norms and institutions that we have to understand and defend. The second big point is what we're getting onto now. And that point is you're being manipulated, that there are very powerful techniques of information warfare. I call it epistemic warfare, which can disrupt the constitution of knowledge and are designed to do that. And they're in wide use right now, turbocharged by social media. So what is epistemic warfare? What is information warfare? By that, I mean, it's the organization and manipulation of the information and social environment and media environment for political advantage. And specifically, you want to dominate, disorient, and ultimately demoralize your political opponents. These techniques go back forever. They were especially well developed in the early 20th century by people like Lenin and Hitler and Goebbels. Vladimir Putin is a master of them. Donald Trump is a master of them. Ayatollah Khomeini was a master of them. So what are we talking about here? Now, specifically to your question. The two big ones that are working today are disinformation, and that's Steve Bannon, flood the zone with shit, and canceling. And that's the use of social coercion to try to intimidate and silence people, shame them, and make them feel ashamed of how they believe. Both of these have been turbocharged by social media. You know, it used to be pretty difficult. If I wanted to cancel, I don't know, Jed Lea-Henry, I'd probably, have to get something published in a newspaper and then maybe hope that other people will see it. Well, now it's trivially easy. I just hit a Twitter button and I can organize hundreds or thousands of followers to denounce you and go after your employer, and then your employer will threaten you with firing you. You'll get investigated, and you'll be very careful to be silent after that. And so will many of the people who've watched this all happen. Defective stuff.
Sounds terrifying, I tell you.
Yeah, and my book is full of cases of it to explain how it works. It's very sophisticated because not only is it directly impactful in terms of, it chills people, it silences them because they're not sure what they can say without getting socially targeted, but it messes with their brains. This is sophisticated psychological warfare because it can create a false consensus. If you're silencing all the people, for example, who think affirmative action is a bad idea on a college campus, then the people who believe that don't know that anyone else believes it. They come to think they're isolated, that they're in a minority, and that deeply affects how we see ourselves. We think, well, this must be a shameful view. It must be wrong. No one else believes it. So they become ashamed. It actually changes the way they perceive the world. So this is called consensus falsification. Consensus spoofing is what I call it. So this is really sophisticated stuff on the one hand. And then on the other hand, the direct information warfare, the Russian style stuff, which is what Trump and MAGA are so good at. So this is stuff like conspiracy bootstrapping. That's where Trump holds a rally and says, some people are saying that Hugo Chavez is responsible for tampering with all these voting machines. And that's a signal to conservative media to pick this up and circulate it. It goes viral. And then you bootstrap that by saying, well, maybe it's true. How do we know it's not true? Why aren't you investigating it? If the media debunk it, then they give it more airtime. That further lodges it in people's brains. If they let it go and they don't debunk it, if they try to ignore it, it just spreads without any refutation. This is an impossible dilemma. It's very sophisticated stuff. In a democracy, the only real way to deal with that tactic is not to use it in the first place. But Trump and MAGA burst right through that. And then there's so-called fire hose of falsehood. This is a tactic that the Russians perfected. Trump is even better at, and that's the one we talked about earlier, flooding the zone with shit. It's where you put out so many falsehoods, conspiracies, lies, half-truths, exaggerations through so many channels simultaneously. The media can't keep up. They can't knock it all down. The public no longer knows what to believe. They become confused and cynical. They say, well, I don't know. Maybe it was the Russians who hacked the DNC server. Maybe it was the Ukrainians. We'll never know. Now they're saying 2020 election. Maybe Biden won, maybe Trump won. We'll never know. I mean, I'm hearing so many of these theories about election fraud. I'm sure some of them are true. Trolling. This is another big one. This goes back to Hitler, who says in Mein Kampf, it doesn't matter if they insult us or make fun of us. What matters is that they can't stop thinking about us. So what's Donald Trump doing when he, tweets absurd and obscene insults? Or says outrageous things, says that an African-American member of Congress should go back to her own country. He knows this is outrageous. And he told his aides he knew it was outrageous. He's using it to dominate the news cycle because he knows that we cannot stop thinking about outrageous behavior like that. It's so transgressive. It's so horrible. We have to denounce it. We have to rise to it. That's how he kidnaps our attention. So these are very powerful techniques, and they've never been more powerful than they are right at present. And they are efforts to disrupt and dominate and destroy the constitution of knowledge. And that's why it's so important to get serious about understanding them and countering them in a way that I think we really haven't so far.
Why do you think that is? You were really central to this. You wrote in your first book, I'm going to a little quote here, "It amazes me how little attention we pay to the knowledge-making business." And I wonder, again, this is from your second book now, you talk about a moment with Steven Pinker when people were trying to cancel Steven Pinker or shout him down for very innocuous comments. And I wonder why. I was thinking about that first quote from your first book, and I wonder whether that episode might explain a few things, because you go on to say that it wasn't about Steven Pinker. It was about Jed Lea-Henry or someone similar who doesn't have an audience, doesn't have the rigidity and the defenses. It's for everyone else out there. And I wonder whether you think that if we'd better understood that when someone like Pinker is being attacked, the target is not Pinker, it's us, then we would behave differently.
Yeah, that's right. The target's the whole information environment. Remember, that's what information or epistemic warfare is. It's the organization and manipulation of the media and information environment for political advantage. And one way to do that is you put so many landmines out there, people chill themselves. They're not sure what they can say. So yeah, Steven Pinker survives an attempt to cancel him in actually quite an absurd way. A bunch of people went through everything he's ever written and tweeted and came up with 6 examples of stuff that they thought that they tried to charge him was racist. And the examples were self-evidently trivial and absurd. And he's a prominent guy, so it didn't really do him any harm. The real audience there were the smaller fry. That's people like you and me. We look at that and say, well, gosh, I don't want that to happen to me. I better keep my head down. One of the keys to, if you want to manipulate the environment and not just the individual, and that's really the key to having wholesale success in dominating the media, the environment, you don't want people to know what it's safe to say. You don't want to create safe harbors, or as long as you don't say something specific about race, you're not a racist. You want to, in fact, create an environment where no one's ever sure where the boundaries are, where you can get subject to a massive canceling campaign for something that seemed quite innocuous when you tweeted it. And that happens all the time. That's deliberate. That's an attempt to create so much uncertainty, so much chilling that people will self-censor in a random way. The ultimate goal of all of these tactics, Jed, is demoralization. It's to make people so unsure of themselves, so unsure what they can say, unsure what's true, unsure what to trust, unsure whether the institutions are really on their side, that they become demoralized and cynical. And why would you want to demoralize a population? Well, because demoralization is demobilization. Then they won't vote. Then they won't push back. That's the environment you need if you're a Putin or a Trump, or if you're a hardcore illiberal, I don't know, whatever they're called, woke activist, some sort of authoritarian on a college campus or on social media, and you want to control and manipulate the situation for political gain. You want to demoralize the other side. You want them to make them feel it's just futile to fight back. The odds are so against me. No one believes what I believe. There's no one like me. I can't change the system. I can't do anything. I'm just going to put my head down. I'll graduate from this university in 2 years, or I'll do my research in ways that don't challenge whatever the approved line is on race or sexuality or gender. And they submit. That's the ultimate goal, submission.
Let's talk on that. This leads us quite neatly into where you finished your first book. And this is Franklin Kemmeny. I think I'm pronouncing this Kemmeny.
Kemmeny, yeah. Kemmeny.
Yeah, so it's extraordinarily important story at the end of your second book, and an extraordinarily important life. And it does lead from what you were just saying there about this need for courage, but also optimism. Change does happen. It is achievable, and silencing, if you have truth on your side, silencing will not last indefinitely. Truth is this thing that will survive even after we are long gone. There is a wonderful perpetual moment and perpetual existence to truth. So take us to Frank Kemeny and this extraordinary life and extraordinary battle he had for equality.
Frank Kemmony was the greatest American gay and lesbian rights activist of the last century. Most people have never heard of him. That's kind of a crime, because the list of his firsts and the things that he did go on and on. He was very, very brief biography. He was a scientist, a PhD astronomer, worked for the U.S. Army Map Service. It was discovered that he was gay, so he was fired because you couldn't be homosexual and work for the U.S. government. That was true until 1975, 15 years into my own life. Unlike most people, he did not crawl away in shame. He fought back. He believed that the Declaration of Independence promises of equality was a promise specifically to him. He wrote to Congress. He filed the first gay rights lawsuit before the Supreme Court. You can read his brief today. It's remarkable. He tried to sue the U.S. Civil Service Commission, which is the federal employment agency that fired him. He and others, but he was an instigator, led the first gay rights marches in front of the White House and, not coincidentally, Independence Hall in Philadelphia in 1965. First gay man to run for Congress in 1970, led the campaign to delist homosexuality as a mental illness. That battle was won in 1973. Kemmeny called it the greatest mass cure in history. Probably was. People like me were considered mentally ill, insane, treated with shock therapy, in some cases even lobotomy. In the case of Alan Turing in the UK, it was chemical castration. And I could go on. Extraordinary life, lived to 2011, long enough to receive a formal US government apology for his firing. Just extraordinary. Delivered by the agency that had fired him, which by 2011 was led by a gay man. Just a phenomenal story. But Kemmeny was a scientist, and he never shrank from debate. You would never hear him say, I'm too fragile to encounter this point of view, or I shouldn't have to explain it. Go educate yourself. He was confrontational. He believed that the fundamental ally that he had was knowledge, that he was correct in saying that homosexuality is not a threat to anyone, is not a mental illness, that his interpretation of the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were correct. I think he understood, I don't know that he'd put it this way, but I think that he understood that where hate comes from against minorities and intolerance is not that everyone gets up every day and says, who can I hate on today? That would be fun. It comes from fear and from ignorance. If you believe that homosexuals are seducing your children, endangering your country's security, bringing God's wrath down on your country, then you will hate and fear homosexuals. So he understood that debunking all of that was the key to ending hate. And that generation largely did. It breaks my heart, Jed, probably more than any other aspect of all this, to see so many minority rights advocates, of whom I'm one, but so many minority rights advocates turn against the open society, argue that free speech is a sort of conservative thing that traumatizes people and oppresses people. Nothing could be further from the truth. It was the Popperian process of seeking knowledge in an open society that got us, that debunked racism, that debunked the notion that women were a kind of subordinate secondary species that couldn't look after themselves, that showed that the myths about homosexuality were wrong. It's doing the same thing for trans people right now. This is the greatest engine of moral progress and equality. And to view it as hostile to moral progress and equality, that's very painful to see, because it's so wrong.
There is a point where, again, I think it's the end of your second book, where you offer another alternative to that as well. And this is important to add to that. You say that often you do stand up and you do challenge people, and then often you make a decision not to. You often make a decision to let them suffocate without oxygen. And you said that is actually quite an important thing to do occasionally. Of course, it takes the right judgment, but sometimes it is an important pathway as well.
Yeah, you need two things. I mean, everyone's not going to be confrontational all the time, and they shouldn't be. Frank Kemmeny was unusual in his willingness to do that. He probably had some version of Asperger's. So most of us, most of the time, don't necessarily need to be confrontational, but when we're ganged up on, silenced, for example, in a campus environment by other students who say you're white, so your views don't count, basically shut up, don't shut up. I talk on campuses all the time about free speech. And something I started hearing about 5 or 6 years ago a lot was, what do I say when people disqualify me from the conversation? Often it's a freshman, maybe sophomore. Usually it's a white male. What do I say to counter that? When they say, you're privileged, check your privilege, you're white, whatever. And I would try to come up with snappy lines that they could use, and none really worked. So then I tried to cop out by saying, well, you guys need to figure that out, because what worked for my generation won't work for your generation. That's even more lame. And I finally realized the answer is, it doesn't matter what you say. It matters that you say. It matters that you stay in that conversation. Do not let them silence you. Remember, you're being manipulated here. The goal is to silence you so that you'll feel intimidated and people around you will feel intimidated, and a fairly small group of extremists will own the conversation, and people will think that theirs is the dominant view. So don't let yourself be silenced. You will be amazed if you speak out that there's usually that third person in the room, metaphorically speaking, who's more quiet, who's not directly involved, but is going to hear your arguments if they're rationally and well presented. It's going to think, that person's probably right. It worked for gay marriage. We never convinced the hardliners on the other side. We never will, but we did convince those silent people who were listening and watching and said, what Rauch is saying actually makes more sense. So unmute yourself. That requires some courage, but you'll be surprised how well it works. But the second thing is the institutional context. That's equally important. You've got to make sure that the institutions are set up in ways that protect the values that Popper and I and you have fought so hard for, the open society. So that means college presidents that sign on to the Chicago principles, which defend free speech on campus. It means a social environment where students feel that they can stand up for other students who are canceled. It means creating institutions that reward true viewpoint diversity. That's, I think, where American academia is falling down pretty badly right now. There are whole departments and disciplines where you can go your entire career basically without meeting a single conservative. Well, that's not adequate because it means that too many shibboleths are going untested. So you've also got to make the institutional environment safer for truly open dialogue and conversation. So you got to work both ends of the puzzle at once. And I think if we do that, we win. But if we don't do that, we lose.
A last question, John. And I did save this one for the end, this particular quote of yours, because I've never heard a better encapsulation of Popper's philosophy, and never so well said. And I'm going to come to that in just a second here. But so much of this is about knowledge, and so much of your book is about knowledge and the importance that when we are often silencing people or being silenced, we're missing something important here. We're missing how close the Hobbesian war of all against all is. It's just over our shoulder, and it's knowledge that takes us away from it. And if we stop creating knowledge, we'll go back to it. And you have this. Let's go to that Popperian quotes of yours. This is Rauch, not Popper. You're right. So if we could have a modern society and we could create institutions, I don't think you could do any better than to get your 2 stone tablets and to carve these 2 things into them. The first one, you're right, is no one gets the final say. And the second one is no one has personal authority. So I might get you to finish on that, because I really don't think I've heard a clearer encapsulation of Popper ever before, or a better one, actually. And I can't help but to think that if institutions simply stuck by those 2 commandments, they'd be in a lot better shape today.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's interesting that you see those as embodiments of Popper. The most audacious thing I've ever done in my career is in Kindly Inquisitors, I attempt to boil all of what I call liberal science down to two principles: liberal science, constitutional knowledge, all that. That's the whole open society process that gives us science, journalism, law, all of it. And those two principles are just as you said: no final say and no personal authority. No final say means that knowledge is never beyond question. A debate can always be reopened if there's new evidence, new argument. Knowledge is provisional. And that's a revolutionary social concept as well as a revolutionary epistemological concept, because it means that no one's in a position to shut down a debate. I mean, I may think I've got the right answer on race or gender or sexuality, but I'm not entitled to shut you up if you have a different view. And you might be right. So no one gets the final say. That creates the open-ended conversation, which allows the open society to take place in the process that Popper and others outline. That's where we get free speech. That's the epistemic grounding for free speech. You might always be wrong. The second rule, the empirical rule, no personal authority. So this goes back to what we said about Peirce earlier. Whatever it is that you do or that I do to establish the validity of our beliefs and perceptions must work for any reasonable person. It can't just work for people who are Christians. It can't just work for people who are there the day the miracle occurred. It can't just, you can't have Jewish science versus Nazi science. You can't have Black science versus white science. It has to work for anybody. So that's, again, a very deep epistemic principle. That allows network epistemology. But it's also a very important social principle because it allows anyone anywhere in the world, regardless of race or creed or color, to plug into this vast constitutional knowledge, the reality-based community, and come online and enter their own views, their own evidence, and be able to interoperate with everyone else in the system. And that's a first for humanity. That is a literally species transforming technology, because before that, it was always tribes and sects, each with their own point of view, their own orthodoxies, unable to communicate with each other. Once you've got this open network where people are interchangeable and they're all working on rules that are interoperable, you have today's world where now developing countries are coming into the international scientific network at a fantastic rate. The share of papers that are being internationally co-authored is rising exponentially. I think it grew by 20 to 50%, depending on the country, just between 2006 and 2016. This is a deepening network that allows us to create a reality-based community that spans the entire world, generates more knowledge literally in a single morning than in the first 200,000 years of human history, and is only expanding ever more rapidly. That's all because all of those brains can plug into that network. So that's no final say, no personal authority. And I argue in both books that there's a whole lot that has to be done right in order to get science and law and journalism. You need all kinds of articulated rules and structures. But at the end of the day, if you've got a system with just those two rules, however they're articulated, they will wind up looking a lot like liberal science, like the constitutional knowledge. They will get you most of the way to where you want to go. So those are ultimately the rules that we're defending.
And that is also a wonderful note to end the podcast on. The two books that we've been speaking about today, the first one written in the early 1990s is Kindly Inquisitors, New Attacks on Free Thought. And the most recent one published this year, The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth. Both, as I said before, are absolutely wonderful books, and not just in terms of the epistemology, in terms of the writing, of course. They are books you can devour in single sittings, and I really can't encourage them enough. And of course, I will link both below, and I do encourage all listeners to go and get their hands on them and have a look at a wonderful twist on Popperian epistemology. On that, Jonathan Rauch, thank you so much for your time. It really has been an absolute pleasure.
It's been a joy to be here. I've been looking forward to it for several weeks. You have a marvelous podcast, and to be able to put all of these ideas in a specifically Popperian context, that's something I've long wanted to do. Thank you for that opportunity.